I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies. Okay, good morning.
Good morning, sir. So today on Prosthetic Gods, why Jay wants to give all of us pills to become better people. Moral enhancement.
Pills and devices.
Pills and devices in case the pills run out.
That's right, where those pills don't work as well. Yes, moral enhancement. It's a topic that when I finished Citizen Cyborg, I asked my agent which of the 5 book ideas I had he liked, and he said, Cyborg Buddha, the one about that. And at the time, I was just interested in the question of whether you could use drugs and devices to enhance meditation experience, spiritual experiences. But then pretty quickly, this debate got going in bioethics, particularly in British bioethics, about using drugs to enhance moral sentiments, moral cognition, and to change moral behavior. And I committed to that book project, and it's been a long time in the cooking. But I've written a lot about it in the meantime, and I'm glad that we can have an opportunity to talk about it. As usual, the questions for me starts with, is this any different from anything we did before? Or is it just the intensification and doing it better than we were doing it before?
And is your answer the usual too?
Yes, my answer is the usual, which is that, yeah, we've always been doing this. Psychedelics probably go back, 5, 10, 100,000 years as a spiritual technology, ritual dance, ritual singing, things like that. But also just contemporary use of alcohol and caffeine. It's considered immoral to drink alcohol when you have to get in a car and to try to do your job on alcohol. And it's considered moral to take a stimulant like caffeine to do that. But it's considered moral to take alcohol to go to a party because your disinhibition is a part of what you're intending in that situation. Right. So I think we're already using drugs in ways which reflect the morality of the situation.
Although that's different from using drugs to morally enhance ourselves. So using drugs in a morally acceptable way to enhance the perhaps social features of the situation is different from making ourselves more ethical by taking drugs.
But if your friend says to you, you've drank 2 drinks, I don't want you to drive yet, here's a cup of coffee. They are attempting to morally enhance you before you get in that car. Right. That's the point I'm making.
Yeah. Do you see a difference between the historical practices and what is on the horizon now for moral enhancement? I'll give you my view of the difference. One is, first of all, there's a set of historical accounts that has to do with moral education without sort of helping implements. Like most famously, your friend and mine, Aristotle, that tells us that we acquire moral characteristics like courage and generosity by finding role models and practicing generous and brave behaviors until they become part of us, etc., etc. So that's one thing. And then the other, to your example, is it seems like taking psychedelics or, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes with your friends in the morning while ingesting chemicals are part of a sort of social context. And here, part of what's being made possible is in the morning you take a pill by yourself, you become more empathetic, and you go out into the world.
Well, let's start with Aristotle. I think part of the question is there a natural distribution of moral attributes among human beings? And how should we think about those? So some of us are born ADD, some of us are born psychopathic, some of us are born with other psychological traits that are considered and have been considered up until their medicalization, they were considered moral failings. And is it not moral enhancement to treat those things, even if today we see those things as part of human variation and pathology? So the way that we deal with that today is that there are boundaries to human behavior that are set by psychiatry and by criminal justice. So if you get arrested for various kinds of behaviors that are considered both immoral and illegal, you can go to prison, and then we decide whether we're going to involuntarily morally enhance you by giving you drugs, to treat your psychiatric illness. And I think one example there is sexual violence and testosterone suppression, which is highly debated, but appears to reduce the incidence of sexual predatory behavior in the people who are given testosterone suppressants. So we're already doing it, but at the boundaries of criminal justice and psychiatry. And the question is, as we understand more and more about how we can treat moral failing with drugs and devices, shouldn't people have access to them? And don't we already? I mean, the spread of the diagnosis of ADD before the 1960s, an ADD kid was just considered a bad kid, right? Mm-hmm. And then we medicalized it. And we said, no, this is just a brain, a particular kind of brain. And thankfully, I got diagnosed ADD when I was like 5 years old. And I wasn't considered a bad kid. I was considered a kid whose brain needed a particular drug. And the evidence is that if you give kids with ADD these drugs early enough, they have a lower incidence of being in the criminal justice system because they have better self-control. So I think we're already doing it. That's the question.
I mean, it's interesting. You do raise an adjacent point, which I think is absolutely crucial here, and that has to do with the tendency to medicalize. And it's a double-edged sword in some way. On the one hand, exactly along the lines of the example that you suggest with ADD, and maybe even more controversially with the medicalization of addiction, you sort of take out the language of shame, you take out the language of approbation from all of this, and you say it's a brain condition, right? Which is interesting because that has come to sort of replace the moral component. It's not weak character. It's, questions around differences in brain structure. And yet there probably still is a difference in the role of a kind of moral component in overcoming a kidney problem and overcoming addiction. I think they're not mutually exclusive in the sense of there can be a moral role still in overcoming addiction or even in improving your levels of ADD, a sort of will component or a responsibility component. So one interesting question there, I think, is there a cost, even if there's material grounds for the medicalization? Is there a cost for the tendency to completely see these conditions in medical terms?
Well, just back to Aristotle and the Buddha. I think both recognize that there's this kind of variation and that different kinds of people need different kinds of things. And a whole third of the Buddhist canon is devoted to self-diagnosis of your moral failings and your mental incapacities, and which kinds of meditations you should do given those circumstances. But the question of whether the medicalization removes any kind of moral culpability, I don't think it does, because
not culpability, I'd say responsibility.
Responsibility. When I was a kid and I would do something outrageous, my mother would say, "Did you take your pill?" So the first moral test for me every day was to take the damn pill.
Right.
Right. So, just as you're in AA, right, you acknowledge part of being in AA is to acknowledge that you've harmed people, and that part of what you're going to do not to harm people is to not take a drug.
Yeah.
Right? Now, we also have naloxone and these other drugs now that help you stay sober, because if you drink alcohol, it makes you sick.
Yeah.
And is it immoral for someone in AA to take naloxone because that's going to complement and support their moral behavior? I don't think so.
No, as long as we have your mom's approach here on board, I think that we are actually in the territory of having made progress over the recent past situation of just completely blaming addicts for their addiction. What you don't want is a level of medicalization that completely circumvents responsibility for, improvement. So I think we're in agreement on that part. But maybe let's map out the kinds of moral enhancement that are possible, because I know that your colleague, Professor Sivalescu, has a more extreme version of support for moral enhancement than you do. I'll tell you what I understand from his view and tell me if I'm wrong or what you do and don't like about it. What I get from him is something like we are essentially still glorified hunter-gatherers. We've evolved psychologically to operate in small groups and prefer the people in the in-group to the out-group, and the in-group is not very big. As a result, we're not in good enough shape to take care of population-level crises. We, like Adam Smith would say, we care more about the prick in our little finger than the fate of a small other civilization far away. And so for Sivalescu, the idea for curing that is pushing pretty aggressively on morally enhancing us, so we start caring more about global warming than what car we drive. Yeah. Is that fair? And do you like it?
Yeah. Well, the book Unfit for the Future, which was published 15 years ago now, Sivalescu in person argued that not only that we needed this, but that the world is becoming unsafe because of the proliferation of technologies that individuals could use, and that therefore we couldn't rely on the same kinds of collective security that we had in the past, and we needed to push moral enhancement down to the individual level through mandatory moral enhancement. Now, yeah, they're basically bomb throwers, philosophical bomb throwers. It was a provocation. I don't think even they believe that a universal regime of moral enhancement is on the card.
Well, the Chinese believe it.
Well, that's a good point. And this is one of my concerns, is that the Chinese social credit score system, and probably, if you go back to the Soviet Union, they basically medicalized political dissidents and gave them all the psychiatric treatments to try to fix their political dissidents. And I think you could definitely see the same thing in a Chinese context, but they're trying to come up with a way to do it through digital gamification of society, a moral enhancement where, you immediately, if you jaywalk, it takes a picture of your face, identifies your identity, and flashes it up on a billboard and says, this guy just jaywalked. And that is a kind of collective moral enhancement. Okay, but back to Sivalescu in person, they are arguing for some kind of collective mandatory moral enhancement, which is definitely not, I wouldn't call my approach libertarian, I would call it more social democratic, because I do think that we need to have, I think we need to have as a society some boundaries, right? And that's what I don't see from libertarianism is, that mandatory psychiatric confinement is not something libertarians are very excited about. I think we need to be very clear about there are conditions for mandatory psychiatric confinement and mandatory treatment.
I mean, they're basically saying, like, we are, or at least have been fine with putting fluoride in the water for the health of our teeth and our gums. Given the rampant, widespread assholeness, why not put a little oxytocin in the water? I mean, again, I'm getting the science wrong, but you see the point.
No, you're getting the science right. Oxytocin is precisely what they focused on, and
oxytocin is the love drug, right? The empathy,
cuddle drug,
the cuddle drug, the empathy drug. Yeah.
It's a hormone that's released in breastfeeding, in lovemaking, in hugs. There's all kinds of oxytocin.
And it makes us more empathetic to each other.
Right.
So the argument is, the argument is include that as a food supplement somehow so that you raise the general levels of empathy in the population.
Right. You can actually snort it. You can buy oxytocin and snort it.
Yeah.
And so all kinds of experiments have been done in the last 20 years with moral enhancement with oxytocin. And the general conclusion is, yes, it does increase trust, and it may be a therapy for certain kinds of autism to increase attentiveness to social cues and things like that. Unfortunately, it also turns out that it makes you more racist because it is basically activating the parts of the hindbrain that are social bonding components of our mammalian brain.
So it achieves the opposite result than they want.
Right. It's making you trust people like you.
Yeah.
And it increases outgroup aggression. So it's precisely the opposite of what they were intending. Yeah. But it gets to the debate that they started with John Harris,
But wait. Let me ask you. Let me pause with you there for a second. But suppose X hypothesis that it didn't. Suppose that it achieved exactly what they want. Wouldn't you, based on your previous argument that we've been doing this kind of thing in the past, wouldn't you like it? Wouldn't you have to support it?
Yeah. And I think that there's actually an argument for selective use of oxytocin anyway, because
on a population scale,
not necessarily, maybe more on a kind of therapeutic basis, but
Yeah.
not on a population level. I wouldn't want to put it in the water, but I don't think there are many things I would want to put in the water. That's, again, I'm not a libertarian, but I do think that there should be an element
Why?
of
So,
individual
because that
choice.
is the difference between you and them. Because they do
Definitely.
want to put in the water, or at least that's their provocation.
Yeah, I don't think we have evidence of any drug that put in the water would have a uniformly positive effect. And so I think what we need is to have a more nuanced, personalized approach to moral failing,
Okay.
and for us each to decide. And this gets to what is morality. For me, I don't believe in an absolute morality, so I've been very influenced by Alistair McIntyre's after virtue approach, which is basically a sociological approach. Virtues are things that societies come up with that allow us to live with each other and be relatively happy. And there are different virtues in different societies, and I think some virtues work better than others. But given the virtues of your society, one of which is, will you be nice to other people? Some people just find it hard to be nice to other people. And I think for most of the virtues, people would choose to be more virtuous if they had the opportunity, because it's just easier that way.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to John Harris. John Harris argued, no, the problem with your approach is you want to make people have better moral sentiments, but morality actually is more about moral cognition. And in the case of empathy and the expanding of the moral circle, you don't want to just give them oxytocin, which might make them, in fact, restrict their moral circle. You want to increase their ability to cognitively have cognitive empathy for all kinds of creatures. And that would expand the moral circle. So this has been part of the debate as well. So he would have argued that cognitive enhancement drugs would give us more. And I think a lot of the moral enhancement research supports the old idea that we basically have an animal part of our brain and the more advanced human part of our brain. And the more we can get the human part of our brain in control, the more moral we would be. And so that's John Harris's approach.
And you like that?
I definitely like that. Yeah. I think most of our amygdalic hindbrain impulses have to be ignored by the forebrain in order for us to be moral people. I mean,
you don't
sex,
think
drugs,
they
and rock
could?
and roll.
Yeah, you don't think that they could have a somewhat harmonious. You're a Platonist. You don't think they can have a somewhat harmonious back and forth conversation? You think rationality has to be in control?
I think the forebrain has to filter it, right? If you go to John Haidt's moral intuitions model, which I think he did good work on, he says, look, there's moral intuitions that we shouldn't harm other monkeys. There's moral intuitions that we should share the bananas equally. I'm fine with those. The forebrain's fine with those. The Enlightenment is fine with those. But there's also moral intuitions that poo is stinky, and you should respect sacred things, and you should respect the alpha male, and you should only love your in-group and hate the out-group. And those moral intuitions have to be rejected by the Enlightenment, by the forebrain. So
Enlightenment is committed to rejecting that poo is stinky. That's news to me. Or that's sacred, or that's, I mean, those seem like different status intuitions, those four.
Well, the poo is stinky part gets to the moral neuroscience research, which shows that a lot of our moral differentiation is based on how twitchy our amygdalas are. And you can make people more morally conservative. Like the one experiment I liked was they put some jam on a doorknob before people entered the lab. So they had this kind of sticky stuff on their fingers, and then they did it experimentally. And the people who had the sticky stuff on their fingers were more morally conservative. You can introduce a stinky smell into the lab, and they become more morally conservative. You can show them pictures that are disgusting before you ask them moral questions. They become more morally conservative. So basically, the more twitchy your amygdala, the more morally conservative.
You're saying that I was raised with doorknobs filled with jams, and that's
right. That was your problem.
So the first layer that I'm seeing there, in your view, is that unlike Civilescu and his co-author, for you, informed consent for the consumption of the enhancement is absolutely crucial. But if there is informed consent, then by all means, let's use moral enhancement to make the rational part of our brain stronger, something like that.
Sure. And I think the third tripod there is just behavior, that even if we can't change your brain, we could change your behavior. And that's where the devices come in, that I think we're entering already in a period where our exocortex, the kind of electronic environment that we're building around ourselves, can pay attention to what we're doing and advise us. Like I asked ChatGPT what I could do to be a better public intellectual, and it said, well, you could stop watching so much damn Thai television. And I said, okay, I'll do that.
So your version of moral enhancement is a very rationalist moral enhancement. Another version of moral enhancement, which I wonder what you think about, is this idea, this not Kantian idea, this perhaps more Humean idea, which is most people don't get up for the old lady on the tee because they can't see her for shit. They don't pay attention to her. They're too busy thinking about, getting a raise. And if they could only see her, most people who were brought up halfway decently would get up for her without, deploying the categorical imperative, etc. Is that so? The ability to see, would that?
Yeah, that goes back to the cognitive aspect. Is that part of the cognitive aspect of our morality is being morally educated to recognize the morally salient features of situations and having the attention to look for them. Mm-hmm. And I think that we could enhance that capability anyway. Go ahead.
We could enhance. So if I'm on the tee and I'm always on my phone, or I'm always just thinking how somebody annoyed me, or like I'm just sort of stuck in myself, and as a result not paying attention to the old lady standing there with her baskets.
Your smart glasses should say, "There's an old lady. Get the hell out of your seat." Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the smart glasses are enhancing my attention rather than necessarily my prefrontal cortex application of moral rules.
It's changing your behavior.
Yeah. And for you, there's no difference in this case. It doesn't matter if it's smart glasses or taking an attention-enhancing pill. It's just tomatoes.
Well, if they tell you that there's an old lady and you say, I don't care, then there's a problem. Yeah. But if you care and you're just not paying attention and you didn't notice, then yes,
so
you will want that.
Okay. So as long as I know what this pill is or what these glasses do, and I still decide to take it, you're good with it because of the outcomes, essentially being more pro-social. So I get it more clearly now what the difference between you and Civilescu's more, shall we say, Chinese-like approach is. But, I guess I'm still stuck with this sort of Aristotelian intuition. You're not going to like this, but this notion that morality is an achievement at some level, and there's ways of short-circuiting that and taking shortcuts. I think Americans are especially prone to those kind of moral shortcuts. And I worry that taking pills to get moral results yield the kind of shortcuts that alienate us from our moral qualities. So if I am behaving more nicely to my friends because I took some oxytocin pills or whatever pills that are more acceptable to you, have I genuinely become a nicer person, or am I dependent on pills to be nice to my friends? And then if the prescription runs out, I'm an asshole.
Well, this gets back to the kind of original question that I was asking about spiritual progress and whether you could use drugs to, speed your way along. And there's a debate about the importance. Is it more useful to spend 40 years on the cushion making slow progress, or if you could take a pill, or if you could do the right ritual or whatever and have it overnight, would it be the same thing? And isn't it better to get there? Mm-hmm. My intuition is that it's up to individuals. Some people want to climb a mountain in bare feet, and some people want to take a helicopter, and they both get to the summit.
I have a feeling you're in the helicopter waving to
I'm
the
in the
dude.
Helicopter, man. I do not need to climb the mountain.
See you later, sucker. That would be me. Climbing there, freezing my ass off. Yeah.
Right. But yeah, I think there are certain things that you learn through moral struggle, and maybe there are other things to learn. If we short, like moral struggle of the pedophile, I'm not, I don't think that they need to spend every day struggling in order to learn those lessons.
Yeah, but that's an emergency. You want to make sure people don't get hurt, and you don't give a shit about their moral struggle.
There are lots of moral emergencies in the world, you know.
The little Peter Singer is coming out of you.
Well, there's, the general who decides to triple tap on guys floating on a piece of wood in the middle of the ocean. That's a moral emergency. I wish they had better moral instincts in those situations, or at least had the law in their head. The
law is not a bad moral enhancement. We could start there.
I don't think everyone should be obliged to follow the law, but I think everyone should be aware of the law. Yeah. And I think a lot of people aren't.
Yeah, but I think, to some extent, there's a false moral dichotomy between the guy in the helicopter and the guy climbing the hill. So psychotherapy is an interesting use case for, I think, the kind of question.
Gets back to my distaste for psychotherapy. I don't believe in the long slog.
There you go. But so I do. And that is probably a conversation for a separate episode where we can fight about that. But actually, the evidence here is pretty straightforward that in the context of psychotherapy, be that, by the way, psychodynamically oriented or cognitive behaviorally oriented, the most effective treatment combines SSRIs and talk therapy. Right?
Complementary.
A complementary approach. You get better results than just taking pills or than just talking to a therapist. And yet, culturally, in this country, both with depression and with anxiety, many, many people just go to their primary care practitioner and ask them for an SSRI because there's a pill for it. And they want to move on. Now, there is a pill for it that helps you solidify the skills that you would have to learn if you're in CBT, or the patterns that you would have to learn if you're in psychodynamically oriented therapy. But what ends up often happening is most people just say, give me the damn pill and, put me on the helicopter. That, I think, is a problem. I think that creates more shallow people. You don't.
I mean, I think it's always good to, like the WHO, we were going to talk about this in the afterward, but the WHO just issued a statement, said GLP-1 drugs are great. They're miracle drugs. Everybody needs to have access to them. Only 10% of the people in the world who do have access to them have the access.
Who do need access to them have access.
Who need access. But they also said it should be part of a comprehensive obesity management program that includes therapy and exercise, and it's like, of course, yeah, sure, why not?
Yeah, but you see, but you're giving away your approach by how you're taking that. So for you, is that's kind of the therapy behavioral part for you is sort of hand wavy, mainly, give me the GLP, and for me they're inseparable.
It's hand wavy because 95% of people who try to lose weight with diet and exercise fail. Right? That's why it's hand wavy. It's like, yeah, of course, why not? Try. Mm-hmm. But 95%, it's the evidence is it fails, right? And this is the same with addiction. You disparaged the notion of fixing addiction earlier, I guess.
I didn't disparage it. I just said that there was a moral and medical component, that it can't be complete, that there's a cost to completely medicalizing it, although it has to be somewhat medicalized.
It has to be medicalized.
Yeah, I agree with you.
It's so hard
because it's medical.
Right?
Because it's medical, but it's
medical problem.
It's absolutely, and God
and
knows I agree.
The moral
it's
component is take your damn pill.
It's just a different medical problem than having a kidney failure. That I do think it's like of a different category,
right?
Because it's subject to the will. You can't involve your will in curing a kidney failure, and I think you can and have to involve your will with the medical procedure in curing addiction.
Yeah. Just to say something about the model of virtues that I've been working with, there's the positive psychology movement that I've been influenced by, which is people who say that psychology should be about not just pathology, but also what are the building blocks, the psychological building blocks of well-being and so forth. And one of the questions that comes out of that is how much should we treat happiness itself as a virtue, right? Eudaimonic.
As opposed to a pathology.
As opposed to a pathology, or as the product of virtue, right? So the classic kind of religious approach is that that if you're a good person, it may not make you happy to be good in itself, but the product of being a good person is a eudaimonia, a well-balanced well-being that will be happier than simple pleasure. And I basically agree with that, but the evidence is also that the happier you are, the more daily positive mood you have, the more likely you are to be a good person. The nicer you are to other people, the more you fulfill your moral obligations, the fairer you are, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think one of the questions here is if we come up with good, happy pills, most people would see that as contrary to being moral. And I would think that it would be, in general, supportive of morality. What do you think about that?
I don't buy it. I'm more...
You don't buy it? Yeah, you don't like that idea?
I hate it. I mean, I'm more straightforwardly, old-fashionedly Aristotelian. Happiness or eudaimonia is a human achievement. It comes from people doing what people are supposed to be doing, which is essentially rationally regulating their desires or bringing their desires and their rationality into some kind of dialogue in different areas of life, learning how to find the mean between excess and deficiency in different areas of our life. And it takes time. It's hard. Not everybody can do it. Some people are screwed and have bad luck and can't do it. Unlike you, I'm willing to accept that. Where I think drugs could fit in is if you start at an absolutely problematic starting point for the capacity to regulate your emotion, like with ADD, which you were talking about earlier, then you should be allowed to take drugs, or you should be encouraged to take drugs to bring you to the starting point where you can do it. So I'm very happy with that. My worry is, and that's progress over, ancient Athens.
And I think most Buddhist psychotherapists would agree with you.
Yeah.
That antidepressants are okay, but not happy pills.
Yeah. My problem is that very quickly when you start taking say, in the case of the ADD, the drugs that bring you to the equal starting point as the person who doesn't have it, the question begs itself, well, why don't you just, if you can, take some more or some other ones to save yourself the process, the hard work of acquiring it, and just go into, Jay's pink-colored smiley helicopter. And that's where I have trouble. I think you just feel like less of a person when you do that. Because then why not go into the next helicopter, right? It's helicopters all the way up.
I'm not sure. I don't see the problem with the helicopter, but yeah. I mean, what I want is for us to have a moral control panel. I want us to have sufficient control over our brain so that we can make decisions about how to proceed. And I think for me, the risks that I see in that scenario is that we live in a
human
society.
Beings are not control panels. We can't have a moral control panel. You can have one in your new Dell, but we are not, it's harder to modulate our different intentionalities than it is for a machine.
It is harder. I definitely agree. For me, one of the connections here is personality theory, that there's the 5-factor personality model. Agreeableness is one of the 5 factors, and extroversion and conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is basically self-control. It's a virtue. And agreeableness is a virtue, just being a nice person to other people, being pro-social. And so insofar as we have evidence and ability to change these fundamental personality traits, the only drug that we have so far that fundamentally changes personality is psychedelics, which increases the amount of openness to new ideas that we have. But insofar as we get control of those things, I do think we will have a personality and moral control panel. And my worry about that is more sociological, that there's this critique of the idea of moral personality called situationism, which is the argument that there is no moral personality. There's no such thing as a courageous person. You put courageous people in different situations and they will be courageous in some and not courageous in others, and that everybody who got sent to Abu Ghraib would end up a monster. And I think that there's a problem there, because if there's no absolute morality, as I don't believe there is, and we're just trying to distill what are the moral virtues that I need to embody in order to be happy in this situation. Well, if I'm a soldier at Abu Ghraib, I need to be a monster to be morally happy, to be happy in that situation, not to be moral, but to be happy. And that's what I worry about, is that that moral control in the context of an oppressive society, not to mention China or a fascist society, would be terrible.
Wait, so I think I missed one step. You do or don't believe in kind of stable moral characters? You buy into this extreme moral situationism, or you don't?
I think the situationists overstate it. I don't think that we're complete tabula rasa. I think there is evidence that we carry some moral predispositions, personality predispositions from situation to situation, that an agreeable personality is more agreeable in most situations. But I think they're partially right. I mean, the evidence is also there that you can be agreeable in one situation, not agreeable in others. You can be conscientious in one and not conscientious in others. So there is a sociological influence. And that's why I, as a techno-progressive or whatever, I think that we can't just talk about individual moral change without talking about moral societies and moral situations.
Yeah, there's a movie many years ago, like 20 years ago. I'm blanking on its name. It may have been Crash, but I'm far from sure that it was. Anyway, Kevin Bacon in it was this police officer, and it kind of begins with a scene that he stops a couple and sexually assaults the woman. So he's like I think it's a black couple, and he's like a racist, awful cop. And then further on in the movie, he runs and saves somebody from a burning car. And then further on, he is very intricately and lovingly taking care of his dad. And you get this sort of very depressing moral situationalist kind of picture that this person is clearly capable of doing the worst imaginable things and also behaving, tenderly. It's an interesting example of it.
One more example is Pluribus, this new TV show with Vince Gilligan.
Yeah.
It centers on Rhea Seehorn in an apocalyptic world that turns out to be much nicer than most apocalypses we could imagine. This kind of hive mind takes over the planet. And she is clearly portrayed as someone who is misanthropic and not a moral person, right? She's just a grumpy...
Hold on, she's misanthropic and therefore she is a moral person. She's my hero. I like her.
Precisely, that's the conclusion, is that the situation changes and her misanthropy becomes a morality because her individual resistance to the society becomes the basis. And that's the point I would make about situationism. If you believe in situationism, that we have no moral character, moral enhancement is precisely the way to get a moral character.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. So I'm horrified by situationalism, first of all, even if it's true. But part of your argument is that moral enhancement is the way to kind of give yourself an insurance policy against the risks of situationalism.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. I mean, that's a good argument. I want to ask you two questions. One is, can you sort of sketch a day in the life for me of a person who takes moral enhancement? Like how does it actually look different from your life right now? Like,
Well, if you do, actually the positive psychologists, they did a lot of work on trying to come up with self-diagnostic tests where you could try to figure out what your moral strengths and your moral failings are. And they made an argument that I don't really believe, which is that given the impossibility of changing our moral character, you should lean on your moral strengths and just, deprecate your moral weaknesses. I think precisely the opposite. If you come to the conclusion that you're not as nice a person as you want to be, you should try to be nicer, and that we will have ways to be nicer people. So there's some things that, if depending on how long-term your disability is, like with ADD, it's a daily thing that you have to treat every day. And it may be that becoming a nicer person, or antidepressants, and et cetera, et cetera. But there are other things that are more situational. And so, like if you're going, the example of work, the demands of a work situation, the demands of an athletic competition, the demands of a party, they're all different demands. Yeah. And so you would have different moral settings for those demands.
Yeah. So I'm just sort of writing this scenario in my head. Say you're a college student who's also a physician assistant and also has a circle of friends. You get up in the morning, you have difficulty, like most college students at this point have, of focusing for more than 10 minutes on what's being said in class, but you feel bad because it's not polite. So you pop an ADD drug before getting into class so that you can pay attention. And then after class, you go to work and you're worried that you're grumpy today and you won't be empathetic enough to your patient. So you pop a little oxytocin to be nicer to your patients. And in the evening, you maybe take a pod gummy before you go to take an Uber to a party, so you're nicer at the party. And I get it. It just seems like the more you do this, ultimately your life is not your own.
Well, if you are making the choices, then your life is your own, right?
You're making the choices to make your life not your own.
Well, that doesn't compute for me. If I am in control of making these choices,
you cannot have your life without these pills. Instead, you should walk up the hill, like build up the muscle. I mean, I guess that is a fundamental disagreement between us. I mean, my sense is that there's something not empowering but disempowering, and in the end, something alienating about this. I would take any of these if I had a genuinely pathological deficiency in these areas. If I had serious social anxiety, if I was, I hope I wouldn't end up a PA if I had serious deficiencies in empathy, because that sounds pretty scary, or if I had actual ADD in class. You know what this is turning into it's turning into the usual enhancement versus therapy debate in a way.
Yeah. Well, I think there's another connection here, which is that the Buddhist perspective, it rejects the idea of an authentic self, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there is no such thing as the self, and there's definitely no such thing as an authentic self. So changing your moral character is not a violation of authenticity for a Buddhist.
Yeah.
It's just... and it's in fact, the goal is to change your moral character.
Yeah.
That's the whole point of being a Buddhist.
It's interesting, the difference between, I think the Buddhist and the Humeans, who I'm sympathetic to, sort of agree on the premise and disagree on the conclusion. The Humean says kind of like it's a good idea to pretend anyway for social reasons that there's an authentic self, which I like. But
well, I think we need to have the idea of moral culpability over time. So yeah, if it
doesn't really have philosophical grounds.
Right. I mean, I can't say I'm not responsible for what I did yesterday because I'm a different person today. That doesn't help us in society. And I don't think any Buddhist would have ever argued for that. But in terms of, should you be freaked out by the fact that you change your mind? Do you kill yourself when you change your mind? I don't think that makes sense either.
Yeah. Let me offer you, since my levels of empathy are high without oxytocin, I've entered the J. Hughes mind, and I'm going to offer you an argument for moral enhancement.
Okay.
Based on my grumpy premises here. In effect, we are already taking a large dose of a moral degradation drug, all of us, on a daily level. And
social media?
And that has to do with social media, right? Social media has largely plummeted our capacity to pay attention. Our colleague Gloria Mark has argued in a wonderful book recently, to about 47 seconds.
And feeds our baser instincts.
And feeds our baser instincts on purpose, right? Based on pretty sophisticated behavioral research. So maybe the argument for moral enhancement drugs is to actually return us to baseline, because our Silicon Valley overlords have kicked us away from baseline.
I'm opening up. I mean, maybe this is the beginning of our Burkean socialist convergence here.
Yeah.
Is I'm opening up to the critique of social media. But for me, I still think it would bring me back to the idea of a moral exocortex. When ChatGPT told me to stop watching Thai television, it was saying you have a behavioral pattern which is not consistent with your moral aspirations. Change your behavior. And I think we should have that kind of feedback, maybe from humans as well, but certainly from our machines that are paying attention to us. And I think social media, the evidence is accumulating. I think there may be still a moral panic and publication bias, replication crisis, to this social media research. There are plenty of studies that show, like a study just came out of Japan, that the more time kids spent playing video games in Japan, the less trouble they got into. There's research that shows that the spread of electronic access to pornography reduced incidents of sexual violence because people were in their basement instead of out committing rape. So I think there's some evidence on the other side. But I'm willing to acknowledge that and this is a part of the sociological critique, is that we are under lots of immoral pressures in our society, and we need to change society.
Cigarettes also had profound social benefits and concentration benefits and weight loss benefits, and they were still an awful idea.
Yeah, but nicotine turned out, I'll just say about that, nicotine turns out to be one of the most well-documented cognitive enhancers out there, and does not cause cancer or emphysema or anything. And so I think the spread of pure nicotine consumption is not in itself, just because it's addictive, it does not mean that it is bad for us.
Yeah, an even better cognitive enhancer is, read Tolstoy or George Eliot. Just takes longer.
I'd be willing to do the experiment where giving people nicotine and giving people George Eliot and see which one ended up smarter. But of course, the problem there is that people have to finish the George Eliot.
Yeah. But,
it's a lot easier to take the nicotine.
Yeah, but people's laziness can be the basis for public policy. But I guess that's something we disagree on.
Can't it? I mean, this gets to the cold question about moral nudging and kind of libertarian paternalism, is like, if we acknowledge that people have cognitive and moral weaknesses, and that part of the reason that we want to restrict addictive substances is because we recognize that this is a problem. We can't just have everything be available to everyone all the time. Then that is an acknowledgement of people's moral weaknesses. Yeah. And I think public policy does need to take that into account. And part of that means giving people pills instead of saying, you really should be exercising and dieting and being a better person.
Yeah. One maybe last question before we move to our news roundup that I wanted to run by you. I wanted to borrow this point from Oakeshott, 1950s English philosopher. And he has this interesting set of distinctions about the difference between change and innovation, and he gives some criteria for evaluating new innovations. And one of the criteria that he gives, which I think are particularly interesting, is you can't look at an innovation divorced from the context which it's being innovated into. So chatbots may or may not be great, but they are being innovated into a context when we've sort of already become somewhat degraded by social media, and therefore are more probably prone to become addicted to them than we would have if they had been introduced before social media. So if I take my bearings from some point like that, if there was a real push for moral enhancement, it is it's innovated into a society that's more polarized than it's ever been before. When there is a willingness and, in fact, a sanctity of, canceling people both from the left and the right. People are so confident in their moral positions, and those moral positions talk to each other so little that I'm almost sure that they would be willing to push a moral enhancement on somebody else to tote the correct line. Does that worry you?
It does, and it's a part of the kind of sociological aspect of the moral enhancement argument that I want to make, which is that, when I was working in Sri Lanka, I did some work on local legal mediation that allowed people to not have to go to court, but have their marital disputes and other things worked out with local tribal leaders, basically. And what I saw a lot of was people going in and saying, well, I think you should really pay more attention to the authority of your husband. You're just being a bitch in this situation. And it's like, well, that's not what they should be told, But if we had moral enhancement in a society with deeply patriarchal values, you could imagine that, as we did, when people were getting electric shock treatment for being gay or not just being gender nonconformist before World War II, when we had, forcible eugenics for people who had other kinds of behavioral differences in society, that's going to be a problem to distinguish that. But even if we're in a society that isn't patriarchal, that does accept homosexuality, if you say to someone, look, you feel that you are in the wrong gendered body. And you could spend the next year taking hormones and trying to change your gender, or we could give you this pill, which just changes your brain so that you feel like you're in the right gendered body. Which will people do? I think that there's a significant risk that moral enhancement could reduce the amount of moral nonconformity in society because it's just easier to be morally conformist. And I worry about that.
Yeah. All right, sir. Let's proceed to discuss the grand issues of the day.
Okay. The issues of the day. First, I have been, for 20 years, anxious about the fact that the left, its approach to technology is generally dismissive, hostile, skeptical, whatever. And Bernie Sanders recently has gotten the techno-progressive religion, and he's hooked up with Jeffrey Hinton, who is one of the pioneers of artificial intelligence and who also is a socialist. And the two of them have been on speaking engagements, and Bernie has been writing editorials and pushing in social media and pushing legislation that takes seriously artificial intelligence's threats to society, including existential risk, which most people on the left just dismissed out of hand, but also the possibility that it would erode employment, that there would be technological unemployment. So I'm just very excited that American democratic socialists might be getting on the right page on this. Hinton's British, but
yeah. What do you make specifically about the Hinton Bernie Sanders connection? Because Hinton is kind of skeptical that large language models is the best direction specifically that we should be going in, right?
Well, I don't think Bernie has a position on that, nor should he. But yeah, I think Hinton. I think the position that Hinton's taken, a lot of people are beginning to converge on, and all the LLM people are saying, well, we never said that LLMs were the only thing you needed. And it's like, well, it sounded like that's what you were saying. If you just gave you another $1 trillion, you'd be able to get us artificial general intelligence. But yeah, I think Hinton is obviously right that just yesterday, I asked Meta AI for gift suggestions from my family, and it came up with completely absurd descriptors of my family members, and then paired my son's wife with my daughter and my son and vice versa. And so completely idiotic, but we had a good laugh about it. So I don't think it has any common sense.
Bobbleheads of Mark Zuckerberg for everyone.
Exactly. Yeah, right. Exactly. It's obvious that LLMs do something very well, but most of the things they don't do well at all yet. Mm-hmm. And so we need a more comprehensive, common sense world model behind these things. And we may be getting it very shortly. I mean, I don't think that that's that far away. So we'll see.
The other thing that's good about Bernie is he's very grumpy. So I'm, there's a few things about him that I like.
Good.
Yeah. He should be in Pluribus. I feel like he should be like a guest star on Pluribus. He would fit.
He might be the model. I mean, when I asked ChatGPT what a Burkean socialist would look like, he basically described somebody like Bernie. So, the EU, unfortunately, is not the social democratic paradise that I want it to be, and has enacted the AI Act, the Digital Services Act, and the Digital Marketing Act, which were all ways to restrict social media algorithms, the riskiness of artificial intelligence models, and so forth. They've gotten huge pushback from the American big tech firms and from European tech firms, saying that these laws were too cumbersome and would restrict Europe's ability to build their own domestic industry. And the American big tech firms are saying to them, look, we're just not going to allow Europeans to use our stuff if you're going to sue us for showing you X, Y, and Z. And so they're beginning to weaken.
It sounds like a parroting of the J.D. Vance take on AI, basically.
Yes. Well, J.D. Vance was a mouthpiece for what the American tech firms,
they're like mutual mouthpieces for each other.
Right. So, but the EU is beginning to respond. The European Parliament is beginning to consider the weakening of their legislation, which I'm unhappy about. And the third thing I wanted to bring to our attention was the WHO expanding access to GLP-1 drugs, which I mean, I just consider it so astonishing that these people I've been working with, or talking to at any rate, for the last 30 years, who are all techno-futurists and medical longevists and arguing for federal investment, anti-aging research. Here's a drug that actually demonstrates, extending longevity, reduces cancer, heart disease, and stroke. And no one's in the futurist community is interested. It's like, well, we weren't interested in obesity. Well, obesity is the major cause of why longevity is not approaching quicker, because we're getting so fat that it's increasing our heart disease and other causes of disease.
Have you been following at all the sort of status quo of where the large American insurers are on GLP? Because they've been doing a dance on it.
Yeah, I mean, they are too expensive. And so Burley, for instance, his approach to this is, well, why do Americans have to spend 10 times as much for any drug as other people do? And it's because we don't allow states or the federal government to have a national formulary or a state formulary that we'll purchase. We'll make an agreement with a pharmaceutical company. We'll purchase that. It was under Bush that was made illegal for Medicare to do, Medicare plans. And so Bernie's approach is, look, if we could do that, or we could just legalize importing these drugs from Canada, where they spend a lot less, that would lower the prices. But that's only, kind of a partial solution to the whole thing. We need to come up with better drugs. We need to figure out how to get them into the hands of everyone around the world, as the WHO is pointing out. The other part of this is the public coverage of this. The cost of GLP-1 drugs is already bankrupting a number of state Medicare and Medicaid state Medicaid plans, and Medicare is also struggling with their costs. And so there's like 13 states that have said we're not going to cover them for Medicaid, and that's a problem.
Yeah. All right, my open-minded friend. I'll see you next week.
Talk to you soon, sir.